will come from the Federation of Philippine Industries. Mr. Meneleo Carlos Jr. is the Chairman Emeritus of the FPI.
Good morning. First of all, on behalf of the Federation of Philippine Industries, allow me to join Secretary Purisma in thanking the Governor Tatanco and his team for giving us a healthy environment. We hope that we can keep on moderating the interest rates perhaps a little bit lower and the inflation rate perhaps a little bit lower too. That would really make us very competitive. But at the same time, I think with climate change threatening agricultural commodities and the inflation rate there, perhaps you could ask your agent banks to take a closer look at their agricultural loan portfolios, and perhaps they could find out why it's not really happening. And perhaps you, together with all the others, can find out how we can make it happen that the countryside will finally receive something from our banks to help them become more productive and perhaps counter the climate change. On the issue of NEDA, I'm glad to see that the focus is on Tao, on the individual. I think Eric just ended up his talk on poverty, and I hope we can keep a focus on that. But the employment opportunities, I think, we've largely missed are in the countryside. We have to take a closer look at what we can do in the countryside, where we can help develop idle lands, idle forests, idle marine resources, to generate a lot of income opportunities and alleviate poverty. I think working with the local government units will be a very good case in this regard. If we can harness the effective government agencies, work with the ILG, and see how we can make the countryside really more productive. On the review of the build, operate, and transfer and the resulting PPP, public-private partnerships, I would like to request you to take a closer look at the resulting public service that PPPs and BOTs have come out with. Is the public really being served better by these private sector enterprises that have resulted from PPP? Or should the government have really stuck to their effort and say, this is part of our job, to render these public services? In other words, perhaps there should be a review whether, in effect, our different utilities, power, water, telecommunications, transport, and all the services have really become competitive because of private sector intervention or not. In many cases, I think they have been well. But I think in many cases, too, it requires a better review on the effectiveness of this partnership. And largely, I think it's due to the need for our regulatory agencies not to be captured. Okay. On the issue of competitive index that Secretary Domingo mentioned, this is something that is very current. We've been in the midst of all of this competitiveness, lack of competitiveness of the Philippines. But I say that I think we should disaggregate where we are uncompetitive. Let us find out. I mean, I've participated in some of these competitiveness surveys, and they're very detailed. I think it is the job of government to look into the background of these surveys, find out line by line where we are not competitive so that they can be fixed. For example, in the case of power, let's say if power, people are complaining about high power rates, power is constituted by generation, transmission, distribution, retail, and other ancillary services, I suppose. Maybe if you can disaggregate it, you'll find out why or where we're not competitive. Another issue, I think, is you mentioned that in the special economic zones, everything is nice and rosy. But outside of these zones, where most of our industry is located, they are not. Are we subsidizing? Are the industries outside of the zones actually subsidizing the services rendered in these special economic zones? Let's find out. But generally speaking, I think what we want is a very competitive environment throughout, whether you're inside or outside the zone. I think working again with the DILG and the local government units will promote a good infrastructure development. I hope that these people running our local governments will respond to the business sector wanting to develop and enter the communities. On trade policy, especially with regard to product standards, we would like to call on our standards as being a reflection of the Consumer Act, that we are there implementing the requirements of the Consumer Act for us to have our local products manufactured up to quality standards. And we are trying to harmonize this with the global standards as well. So it seems to me that the Consumer Act should be primordial in our effort to protect our consumers and to set the appropriate standards. Recently, I think this has been an issue, but I think it also revolves on the fact that our consumer protection in this country is not complete, in the sense that product liability by the manufacturers is not as well established as it is in other countries, where they have managed to liberalize their product standards or the mandatory versus voluntary standard scheme. So maybe perhaps that could be looked into. On the industrial strategy, I think that is reflected in our priorities plan. I think it's nice because you put agribusiness there, and I think it has a lot of development and connection to the countryside. Perhaps you can look at it in a very broad framework, not just agribusiness, but agroforestry, agromarine, and so on and so forth, so that we can really develop an industrial strategy that would harness the poor in the countryside. And finally, on the presentation for the fiscal sector, I congratulate Secretary Purisima for his effort to stop smuggling and run after tax evasion. We managed to talk to the Bureau Commissioner head, and we got from him an idea that it will take about 3 years for him to get his reforms finally put in place. We recommend that you look seriously at the anti-smuggling bill that we have been working, I think, with the office of the Senate President Enrile. And this intends to plug the many, many loopholes that our smugglers have found in our tariff and customs code. I think this is something that should be looked at seriously, because it will help Commissioner Alvarez in plugging the many, many loopholes. Can you imagine that, according to our friends in the oil industry, 1/3 of diesel oil in this country is smuggled? Can you imagine the quantity? People must be thoroughly blind not to see it. On the tariff review, we would also like to suggest that perhaps we should harmonize, rationalize first our tariff vis-a-vis the industry sector itself, where the products downstream must enjoy a little bit more protection than the raw materials upstream. And secondly, rationalize or harmonize this with the rest of our ASEAN neighbors so that we can be truly competitive with them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Carlos.